Well, we're going to deal with an extremely delicate subject, one that's unquestionably going to offend many. We're going to talk about the Vatican expectations. And there's some very difficult material forthcoming here. And as usual, we'll take as our backdrop the 7 epistles that were penned by none other than the Lord Jesus himself that constitute Revelation 2 and 3, where we speak of Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. And we discover, among other things, that lays out a history of the church in advance, strangely enough. In any other order, they would not. We have the apostolic church, followed by the persecuted church, which in what Satan could not accomplish with persecution, he accomplished by having the world marry the church. That leads us to the 3rd and 4th century's invention of what we traditionally call church. And that was followed by the medieval church, and which is followed by the denominational church, the missionary church, and the apostate church. We noticed that the first 3 are unique in that the promises to the overcomer is postscripted outside the body of the letter. In the last 4, the promises to the overcomer are in the body of the letter itself, a distinctive, different structure for some reason. We also noted that the last 4 involve explicit references to the second coming of Christ. So with that structural insight, it turns out the longest letter is the letter to Thyatira, the one that appears to characterize that period of church history which I'll just politely call the medieval church. It has the peculiar promise that if it doesn't get its act together, it's going to be entering the Great Tribulation. A very strange promise, because it implies that if they do get their act together, they won't. And in fact, that's exemplified by the fact that Philadelphia has an explicit promise that they will be exempted from the very time, not just the Great Tribulation, but the period of the Great Tribulation. And of course, then we have 2 problematical ones that remain, the denominational church, as we call it, and the apostate church. One of the provocative things to understand is that Protestant expositional commentators have had a field day dissecting and analyzing the letter to Thyatira, because clearly it has overtones that point to the Roman Catholic Church. But if that's true, then it's followed by Sardis, which is one of the 2 letters about which nothing good is said. 2 of the letters are characterized by having nothing positive. To Sardis, Jesus says, you have a name only, but you're dead. Staggering indictment there to notice. And of course, Laodicea, we've been talking about that. But let's zero in a little bit to Thyatira. Why is Thyatira the longest letter? Well, the principal metaphors here are Queen Jezebel in the letter. The worship of the Queen of Heaven rather than the Lord of the Heaven, interestingly enough. And that's used as a metaphor. And specifically reference is made to the peculiar incident involving Naboth's vineyard. Ahab was upset. He was king, and he wanted this little vineyard. Now, he's got all he wants, but there's this little vineyard bothered, and he wanted it, and Naboth didn't want to sell. And the queen says, no problem, I'll handle it for you. Really? So she arranges false accusations to be made. Lies and deceit cause then Naboth's vineyard, gets him killed, and gets that available to King Ahab. Now that's just an anecdotal allusion in the letter, but it certainly is suggestive of a major portion of church history where the church intrudes by what we call the Inquisition, accusing theological crimes in order to gain property and lands. A time of history that is too painful for us to even imagine what it was like in those days. And so we also find the discussion, the burden on Thyatira of the blood of the saints. That's going to emerge as we look at the history a little more carefully. So one of the things I want to do is just pause. We're not going to take the letter itself and dissect it. We're simply going to take a quick snapshot of church history. And then we're going to end up with Mount Graham, as you'll see. The papacy, a perspective. Now the Pope, that means Papa or Father, you know the term. See, initially it applied to all Western bishops. And about 500 AD, that's late in the scheme of things, it began to be restricted to specifically the Bishop of Rome. It became identified primarily with him. But for 500 years, the bishops of Rome were not popes, interestingly enough. There is this tradition that Peter was the first pope, but that's fiction without any historical or biblical basis whatsoever, by the way. There's no evidence that Peter was ever a bishop of Rome, incidentally. His own foreboding over successors show up in his letters. In 1 Peter 5:3, neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being examples to the flock. That was his concept, quite distinct from the traditions that have surrounded him. And by the way, Babylon, where he speaks from, was a major Jewish basis. We have two Talmuds. What's called the Jerusalem Talmud that was actually done in Tiberias, but the authoritative one is the Babylonian Talmud, which was done in Babylon. Strangely enough, that was a major Jewish site, and so that's where it was compiled. Anyway, by the end of the 4th century, the churches and bishops came largely dominated by 5 primary centers. They had Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. These emerged as the primary. These bishops were known as patriarchs. They had equal authority, each in control of their own province. After the division of the empire in 395 AD, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria came to acknowledge the leadership of Constantinople. Understandably, it was the world capital. And subsequently, the struggle between Constantinople and Rome began. And so that struggle continues. Now, the struggle for supremacy. Cyrus, the Bishop of Rome, in his lust for worldly power, claimed universal jurisdiction over the church. But unfortunately for him, in his day, the empire divided into 2 separate empires, East and West. So the East is beset with controversies. The West, under weak emperors, was breaking up under the barbarians. And so these jawbone attempts continue till Leo I, about 440 to 446. He obtained from Emperor Valentinian III imperial recognition of his claim as primate of all bishops. So he's able to assert himself here. He persuaded Attila the Hun to spare the city of Rome. And when he did that, that gained him a lot of political leverage. He later introduced Genseric the Vandal to have mercy on the city, and his reputation then was made because twice he was able to bring peace. He declared himself Lord of the whole church. He advocated exclusive universal papacy, and he made it stick. He proclaimed that resistance to his authority as a sure path to hell. You see how he's consolidating his power in view of the turbulence of the times. And he advocated the death penalty for heresy. You see that power getting dangerously centered. Well, we get to the fall of Rome. Simplicius was the first Roman pope when the Western Empire came to an end about 476 AD. Notice that the western end dies, the eastern end lasts 1,000 years longer, strangely enough. And so Sonia Gregory I appears as he's regarded as the first real pope. He appeared at a time of political anarchy throughout Europe. His conspicuous leadership over various kings stabilized the times, interesting enough. In his personal life, he was a good man, one of the purest and best of the popes. If more had been like he would, it would have been a very different estimate of the papacy. He labored unceasingly over the purification of the church. He deposed neglectful or unworthy bishops. He opposed the sale of offices. He did a lot of good things. He was a winner, so to speak. Well, then we have the Charlemagne coming along. And so we have a whole series of them, of the Franks, the Germanic people occupying Western Germany and northern France. And Charlemagne, by the way, was a grandson of Charles Martel, who had saved Europe from Islam with his victory at the Battle of Tours in 732. He reigned 46 years with many wars and conquests of vast magnitude. His realm included what is now Germany, France, Switzerland, Austria, Hungary, Belgium, and parts of Spain and Italy. And he helped the Pope, and the Pope helped him. There was an implied partnership there. He is one of the greatest influences bringing the papacy to a position of world power, interestingly enough. We get to the Treaty of Verdun. After Charlemagne dies, the Treaty of Verdun divided his empire into what became the foundations of Germany, France, and Italy. And a ceaseless struggle between the popes and the German and French kings began. The Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman, by the way, but it lasted about 1,000 years until Napoleon finally brought it to an end in about 1806. But then we have the Isidorian decretals. And Nicholas I was the first pope to wear a crown, by the way. And about this time, a book appeared called the Isidorian Decretals, which purported to be letters and decrees of the bishops and councils of the 2nd and 3rd century. They were discovered to be deliberate forgeries. They are regarded as the most colossal literary fraud in history. And they were designed to exalt the power of the Pope, stamping the papacy with the authority of antiquity, antedating the Pope's temporal power by 5 centuries. So then we get to the darkest period of the papacy, the Great Cleavage. Until 869, all the ecumenical councils had been held in or near Constantinople and held in the Greek language. Nicholas undertook to interfere in the affairs of the Eastern Church. He excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople, who in turn excommunicated him. So they're busy excommunicating each other. The claims of the Roman Church became unbearable, and the East finally separated itself. And so we have an era here of bribery, corruption, immorality, and bloodshed, which is one of the darkest chapters of the church, and became wider through the centuries. And so it gets darker and darker as we go here. Then we move into an era that's known as the rule of the harlots. Marozia and her mother Theodora and her sisters filled the papal chair with paramours and bastard sons and turned the papal den into a den of robbers. And this is called, in history, the rule of the harlots from 904 to 963. You get down to John the 12th. He was guilty of almost every crime. He violated virgins and widows, lived with his father's mistress, made the papal palace a brothel, and was killed while in the act of adultery by the woman's enraged husband. So you got a history here that's pretty dark and discouraging. Benedict VIII and John the 19th bought the office of the Pope with open bribery, by the way. And so Benedict IX was made Pope as a 12-year-old boy through a money bargain with the powerful families that then ruled Rome. He committed murders and adulteries in broad daylight and robbed pilgrims on the graves of the martyrs. A hideous criminal. People drove him out of Rome. Some call him the worst of all the popes, Benedict IX. That's going to be, by the way, a contest that has a lot of contingencies. There were 3 rival popes then from 1005 to 1046. Benedict IX, Gregory the Sixth, and Sylvester III. Rome swarmed with hired assassins, and the virtue of pilgrims was violated, and it goes on and gets worse and worse. Clement II was appointed Pope by Emperor Henry III of Germany because, quote, no Roman clergyman could be found who was free of pollution of simony, that is, buying offices and fornication. So that's pretty tough stuff. The cry for reform was answered by Hildebrand, who led the papacy into its golden age from about 1049 to about 1294. He controlled 5 successive administrations prior to his own, and he became Gregory VII, and then undertook a major reform, especially in simony, Gregory VII. Practically all bishops and priests purchased their offices from kings, and this brought him in conflict with King Henry IV, the Emperor of Germany. Devastating wars followed. Italy was devastated by opposing armies. Gregory was eventually driven from Rome and died in exile. He had succeeded in making the papacy independent of imperial power. Then we get to Innocent III. Interesting label. Some of the quotes from it: all things in earth and heaven and in hell are subject to the vicar of Christ. He was the supreme sovereign over the church and the world. But here's the point. More blood was shed under his direction and that of his immediate successors than in any other period of time of church history, except for the time that the papacy tried to crush the Reformation in the 16th and 17th centuries. Innocent III, most powerful of the popes, claimed to be the vicar of Christ, believe it or not, if you understand what that means. And all the monarchs in Europe obeyed his will, including the Byzantine Empire. That's what's so staggering here. He ordered 2 of the Crusades. He decreed transubstantiation as a doctrine. He confirmed auricular confession. He declared papal infallibility. He condemned the Magna Carta and forbade the reading of the Bible in the vernacular. That's the root traditions. This is the roots of what we're talking about, of what we call the Vatican. And he also instituted a thing called the Inquisition. That's what makes Jesus' use of the Naboth Vineyard anecdote in his letter so profound when you really see how that plays out in actual history. The Inquisition. That's called the Holy Office. It was instituted by Pope Innocent III and was perfected by Pope Gregory IX. Everyone was required to inform against heretics. That's scary. Anyone suspect was liable to torture without knowing the name of his accuser. Can you imagine? The proceedings were kept secret. The inquisitor pronounced sentence, and the victim was turned over to civil authorities to be imprisoned for life or to be burned. And, of course, the victim's property was confiscated and divided between the church and the state. They're never without incentives here, are they? A staggering period of history that you and I do not have the capacity to imagine. The Inquisition claimed vast multitudes of victims in Spain, Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands, and did its most deadly work against the Albigenses. Now, who are they? The Cathari in southern France, northern Spain, and northern Italy. Who are these people? They preached against the immoralities of the priesthood. They preached against the worship of saints and images. They completely rejected the clergy and their claims. They opposed the claims of the Church of Rome. They made great use of the scriptures. They lived self-denying lives with great zeal for moral purity. And by 1167, a majority of the population of southern France, and they were very numerous in northern Italy. In 1208, the Pope Innocent III ordered a bloody war of extermination which utterly wiped out town after town. The inhabitants were murdered without discrimination until all of the Albigenses were utterly wiped out. Now, by the way, there is a book that we'll try to hold in our store by E.H. Broadbent. It was published in 1931. It's a history of the groups. And the Albigenses is just one of over 50 of these groups that throughout history tried to stick to the Bible and were invariably wiped out by the established church around them. That kind of abuse wasn't restricted just to the Vatican, by the way. It's astonishing to discover that throughout church history, you want to really take some time and get familiar with Broadbent's history there. Then there are the Waldenses, a similar but not identical group of the same region. They emphasized Bible reading and rejecting clerical usurpation and promulgation, and they were similarly wiped out, except for a few survivors in the Alpine Valley, southwest of Turin, who are now the leading Protestant body in Italy. In the 30 years between 1540 and 1570, no fewer than 900,000 Protestants were put to death by the Pope's war for the extermination of the Waldenses. This is just one group. There's dozens of these through history. Most of the names you probably have never heard of. For 500 years, the Inquisition was the most diabolical thing in human history. What group do you think was really behind this? The Vatican, yes, specifically, but who specifically? A specific group you want to be aware of. We'll get into that. Boniface VIII, in his famous bull, the Unam Sanctum, said, quote, "We declare, affirm, define, and pronounce that it is altogether necessary for salvation that every creature be subject to the Roman pontiff." Do you see the assertion going on here? But he himself was so corrupt that Dante, who visited Rome during his pontificate, called the Vatican a sewer of corruption and assigned him, along with Nicholas III and Clement V, to the lowest parts of hell in his famous document. That leads to the French control of the papacy. The papacy had been victorious in its 200-year struggle with the German Empire, but it met their match in Philip the Fair, the King of France, with whom the history of modern France begins. After the death of Pope Benedict XI, the papal palace was removed from Rome to Avignon on the south border of France, and for 70 years, the papacy was the mere tool of the French court from 1305 to 1377. For the next 40 years, there were two sets of popes, one at Rome and one at Avignon, each claiming to be the victor of Christ, hurling anathemas and curses at each other. This is just part of the history here. And then we get into the Renaissance popes. John the, 23rd? Called by some the most depraved criminal who ever sat on the papal throne, was guilty of almost every crime. As cardinal in Bologna, 200 maidens, nuns, and married women fell victim to his amours. As pope, he violated virgins and nuns, lived in adultery with his brother's wife, was guilty of sodomy and other nameless vices, bought the papal office, sold cardinalates to the children of wealthy families, and openly denied the future life. Quite a guy. Okay, we got Pius II. He was said to have been the father of many illegitimate children. He spoke openly of the methods he used to seduce women and encouraged young men, even offering to instruct them in methods of self-indulgence. And we get to Paul II. Filled his house with concubines, the scriptures say. Sixtus IV sanctions this. He's the one that sanctioned the Spanish Inquisition, decreed that money would deliver souls from purgatory, was implicated in a plot to murder Lorenzo de' Medici and others who opposed his policies, and he used the papacy to enrich himself and his relatives. He made 8 of his nephews cardinals, while as yet some of them were mere boys. In health and pop, his relatives surpassed the old Roman families, interesting enough. Innocent VIII had 16 children by various married women. He multiplied church offices and sold them for vast sums of money, decreed the extermination of the Waldenses, appointed the brutal Thomas of Torquemada Inquisitor General of Spain, and ordered all rulers to deliver up heretics to him. Innocent VIII, what a name. And then we have Alexander VI is the most corrupt of the Renaissance popes. Licentious, avaricious, depraved, he bought the papacy, made many new cardinals for money, had a number of illegitimate children whom he openly acknowledged and appointed to high church office while they were yet children, and he murdered cardinals and others who stood in their way. And then we have, of course, Pius III. Alexander VI had a mistress, a sister of the cardinal who became the next pope, Pius III, and on it goes. Then we run into a guy by the name of Martin Luther. In 1483, he was born into a coal miner, decides to become a lawyer. A violent storm changed his whole life, and he, disillusioned by a visit to Rome, he discovered Habakkuk 2:4, which became his life text. And in October 31st of 1517, we always remember that date because it's Halloween. No, we remember that date because that was the day that Luther nails 95 theses to the door at Wittenberg College. And of course, by December 10th of 1520, the bull excommunicated Luther and to retract with 60 days or death, and he burned it publicly, and the Reformation was born. You know the story. You need to learn the story. It's thrilling. So we get to the centuries of wars, the Diet of Worms, it's called, 1521. Charles V, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which included Germany, Spain, Netherlands, and Austria. They summoned Luther to appear. He says, "Here I stand. I can do naught else, but so help me God." So these wars were started by Catholic kings, urged by the Pope, and Jesuits, which are the primary instrument of the Pope for this, for the purpose of crushing Protestantism. Thousands were killed at the hands of the Caesars of pagan Rome, were dwarfed by the millions killed at the hands of the Vatican. Let me get that very, very clear. There were thousands of Christians killed at the hands of the Caesars in Rome. They don't compare to the millions that were killed at the hands of the Vatican. One pope, one afternoon, murdered more Christians than all the Roman emperors put together. And the century of wars began. The war on the German Protestants from 1566 to 1609, the war on the Protestants of the Netherlands from 1566 to 1609, the Huguenot wars in France, and Philip's attempts against England, all quite celebrated, in the 30 Years' War, as it's called, and on it goes. Julius II was called the warrior pope. He's the richest of the cardinals with a vast income from numerous bishops and church estates. He bought the papacy. He attained and personally led vast armies and issued indulgences for money. And then we have Leo X. He was the pope when Luther started the Protestant Reformation. He was made an archbishop at 8, a cardinal at 13, was appointed 27 different church offices, which meant a vast income before he was 13 years old. And he appointed cardinals as young as 7. He maintained the most luxurious and licentious court in Europe. And this voluptuary reaffirmed, he declared that every human being must be subject to the Roman pontiff for salvation. He issued indulgences for stipulated fees and declared the burning of heretics a divine appointment. So he's quite a character. Adrian VI, and then Paul III, many illegitimate children, on it goes, same kind of thing. The power behind the Vatican is focused on a group that are called the Jesuits. That was Rome's answer to the Lutheran secession. The Inquisition under the leadership of the Jesuits. Understand that. It was an order founded by Ignatius Loyola, a Spaniard, on the principle of absolute and unconditional obedience to the Pope, having its object the recovery of territory lost to Protestants and Muslims, and the conquest of the entire heathen world was the goal of the Roman Catholic Church through the Society of Jesus, as they called themselves. Their supreme aim was the destruction of heresy, that is, thinking anything different from what the Pope said to think. Got the picture? Think Jesuits. Now, this accomplishment was anything but justifiable. Deception, immorality, vice, even murder was an authorized tool. In France, they were responsible for the St. Bartholomew's Massacre, persecution of the Huguenots, revocation of the Toleration Edict, and facilitating the French Revolution. In Spain, Netherlands, South Germany, Bohemia, Austria, Poland, and other countries, they led the massacre of untold multitudes and thus saved the papacy from ruin. Do you have the picture? Okay. Now, the St. Bartholomew's Massacre is Catherine de' Medici, the mother of the king, an ardent Romanist and a willing tool of the Pope, gave the order. And on the night of August 24th of 1572, 70,000 Huguenots were massacred. And there was great rejoicing in Rome. The Pope and his College of Cardinals went in solemn procession to the Church of San Marco and ordered a tome to be sung in thanksgiving. They struck a medal in commemoration of the massacre. They sent a cardinal to Paris to bear the king and queen mother the congratulations of the Pope. Can you imagine this kind of carnage? Well, now we find some interesting, that's a quick snapshot of the background. And by the way, I encourage you to do some homework and validate this history. Let me tell you a very interesting place to find it. I remember as a teenager, I was given a little tiny gift, a little tiny book called Haley's Bible Handbook. I have a huge library, but I can tell you it's still one of the most treasured volumes of that library. It's a book that cost $4 or $5 back then, very inexpensive, very small. I meant to bring one. If you find one, make sure you get an early edition, because it has in the back the summary of what I've just gone through. That's where I got most of that. They did a special edition of Haley's Bible Handbook not many years ago for Billy Graham, but that section was removed. So if you can find a Haley's Bible Handbook with an early print edition, make sure it has that in the back. It's a very, very effective summary of what I've just given you. But now we are all aware of the fact that Tom Horn and Chris Putnam published a book in February of 2012 that had a summary of the various prophecies having to do with popes, and they predicted in that book that the then sitting pope would abdicate. A year later, in February 2013, the Pope, for the first time in 600 years, advocates. And needless to say, Tom Horn and Chris Putnam were headline news in a number of the media because it would have been it was predicted a year in advance. Now, the reason this is so relevant, in the so-called prophecy of the popes, there is a widespread belief among those that really watch this stuff that this pope will be the last pope. He's somehow destined to be the last pope. With the abdication of Pope Benedict XVI, Pope Francis, which is the name he adopted. Now, Petrus Romanus is a title that fits any pope, by the way, so don't get confused. He didn't adopt that particular name. It applies to any pope by history here. It's trying to ascribe the Peter tradition to that. His formal name was Jorge Mario Bergoglio. But here's the thing that everybody misses. He's the new pope. He's taken the place. He is the first pope in history that's a Jesuit. The Jesuits, I forgot to document all that, I think. The Jesuits were so notorious that they were disbanded by the Vatican for so many years and then reinstated. They have a history, as they're almost known as the Praetorian Guard of the Pope. They are the problem solvers. They are the ones that are behind the scenes that are the devil's workmen. So for the first time in history, we have a pope that's a Jesuit. That's kind of interesting. There's a guy that's a very close friend of mine by the name of Malachi Martin. He's very, very well known. He's a former Jesuit. He was personally an advisor to 3 of the popes. He was a very outspoken critic of the ostensible Satan worship within the Vatican. It's widely known among those that watch the Vatican carefully that their sins are not limited to just bribery and these other usual things. Behind the scenes, there are increasing reports of very deep Satan worship. And Malachi Martin was one of those that talked about that. He wrote a book that became a bestseller by Simon & Schuster in New York called The Jesuits, The Society of Jesus and the Betrayal of the Roman Catholic Church. Malachi Martin was among those, not the only one, there were several, but he's one of those that documented the Society of Jesus is the formal name of the Jesuits, and how behind the scenes there is Satan worship going on. That became a bestseller. You can track it down and get a copy of it. Here's a quote from the opening of that book from Malachi Martin. A state of war exists between the papacy and the religious order of the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, to give the order its official name. That war signals the most lethal change to take place within the ranks of the professional Roman clergy over the last 1,000 years. Malachi Martin talking here, a guy who spent his life watching these things from the inside, by the way. In fact, the quote continues, says, as in all important events in the Roman Catholic Church, it involves the interests, the lives, and the destinies of ordinary men and women in their millions. And one of the problems we have, we're obviously not caught up in that network, but there are wonderful people that are. And our challenge as Bible-believing Christians is how to deal with that with love and insight. It takes a lot of prayerful attention. Through a close mutual friend who knew Malachi very well, it is my understanding that Malachi Martin was murdered. Some of the popes were too, by the way, without giving an autopsy. The Jesuits are now the ones, by the way, that make up a technical team that are known as the Vatican Observatory Research Group, the VORG. And so we're going to shift our attention now from this quick snapshot of history, and we're going to shift to the southeastern corner of the state of Arizona. There's a place called Mount Graham that has emerged to be the primary center for those that are interested in astronomy. Many of us grew up in the days that Palomar telescope, the Hale telescope in Palomar, California, was the biggest and the best and all that sort of stuff. That's way out of date. And we want to talk here about the surprising expectations of the Vatican in this project. There is a thing called the Mount Graham International Observatory. It's a division of the Stewart Observatory, the research arm of the Department of Astronomy of the University of Arizona, a highly reputed, worldwide recognized organization. It's located in the southeast Arizona's Pinaleno Mountains near Mount Graham. Scientific researchers from around the world make use of MGI facilities. There are 3 main facilities all located up on Mount Graham, and they're shared by scientists from all over the world. Got the picture here. Okay. Now, there are 3 main facilities up there. The big one is known as the Large Binocular Telescope, the LBT. It's operated by a corporation set up for that purpose. Another facility up there is the Heinrich Hertz Submillimeter Telescope. It's what you and I might call more of a radio telescope. It's tuned in the submillimeter range. And it's operated by the Arizona Radio Observatory. But there's a third facility up there that is a non-trivial facility. It's the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, the VATT. And it's operated by the Vatican Observatory Research Group, the VORG, which are Jesuits, incidentally. Let's talk about this big one, the so-called Large Binocular Telescope. It's over twice the size of the famed Hale telescope at Mount Palomar. Its optical performance is incredible. It's got Strel ratios of 60-90% in the infrared H band and about 95% in the M band. And the Strel ratio is a ratio of peak image intensity from a point source compared to the maximum attainable intensity. It's a measure of how good is the seeing. And the temperature and the altitudes in Mount Graham are outstanding for this very purpose, obviously, and that's why they're there. And the Strel ratio is used to assess the quality of astronomical seeing in the presence of atmospheric turbulence and to assess the performance of any optical system. And so it's the most advanced optical telescope. It uses 2 27-foot wide mirrors that give it the same light gathering ability as if it had a 39-foot wide angle singular telescope. And it's just it's in other words, each one is twice the size of the Hale telescope. It's an awesome piece of facility. And so I've gone through, just to give you a general feeling for the thing. Then we have the submillimeter telescope, the SMT. See, the air is so dry around there and so forth, it's especially good for extremely short wavelength radio and far infrared observations. And that's what this one is primarily aimed at. And so it's located, again, at Mount Graham, and it has a 10-meter wide parabolic dish inside a building to protect it from bad weather, and its construction was finished back in 1993. And these are just some pictures to give you a flavor of what's in there. And then you have the 12-meter telescope, the ARO, and it's at Kitt Peak, also in the general region there. The Vatican Observatory in Italy is one of the oldest astronomical research institutions in the world. It may surprise you. It has headquarters near the Papal Sumner residence in Italy outside Rome. Its dependent research center, the Vatican Observatory Research Group, is hosted by the Stewart Observatory in Arizona. So their headquarters is in Italy, but the real facilities are where they should be, obviously, in Arizona. If you look at a map of Arizona, it's roughly in the southeast corner of the state. And there's a picture of the Vatican Research Group operations situation there. Now, the VAT is a Gregorian telescope observing in optical and infrared. And it's operated by the Vatican Observatory, one of the oldest astronomical research institutions in the world, in partnership with the University of Arizona. The mirror is unusually fast. It's f1, which means its focal distance is equal to its diameter. And so it's a very, very advanced, the most advanced kind of mirror you can build. It's a Gregorian design, so it's used as a concave secondary at a point of its focus. Its seeing is better than 1 arc second, even without adaptive optics. It can be achieved on a regular basis. Very unusual design, very novel. It has been one of the most exact services ever made with a ground-based telescope. And obviously the skies above Mount Graham are unique. So these are some pictures of the Vatican thing. And it happens, by the way, to clarify something, there's also another device, a spectroscopic device, that's primarily used in the big telescope. It was whimsically named Lucifer by the Germans that built it. It's got nothing to do with the Vatican. It's got nothing to do with the telescope. There's a lot of people who are talking when they should be listening, who are causing confusion. There's been erroneous assumptions that it has some connection with the Jesuits of yore. Nothing to do with that. It's a device used in a very special way in other applications. But anyway, let's summarize here. We've talked about UFOs. See, what we discover at Mount Graham is the staff there, which are highly trained astronomers, are openly preparing to receive an alien visitor. Now, the fact that they're doing that is one thing. The fact that they're openly admitting it is another. It's startling. It's staggering on many levels. Now, to summarize what we talked about UFOs, one of the things about UFOs, they have an unresolved paradoxical behavior. They are physical. They show up at multiple radars simultaneously. They leave radiation behind, burnt ground. They are real. And yet, they seem to have the ability to materialize and dematerialize at will. They're transdimensional. What are they? The people who study them are, the more they study them, the more bewildering they are. But here's the other fact that is staggering. The UFOs are shrouded in a secrecy level that is higher than our most sensitive warheads. And I can say that having spent 30 years in the strategic arena. I was chairman and CEO of 4 different publicly traded defense contractors operating in the most sensitive areas you can imagine. And I was stunned to discover, by an unusual accident, that the UFOs enjoy a higher level of security than our most sensitive warhead. Now, the mystery is why. Everybody asks me when I travel, what really happened at Roswell back in 1947? The answer is nobody knows. Lots of interesting legends. The key fact, though, is whatever happened is still classified to this day. 2 presidents and 4 congressmen made a career of trying to crack it and couldn't. The secrecy surrounding that is bizarre. Why are UFOs enjoying that kind of protection? And why is the Vatican, of all people, I thought the Vatican was the most exclusive club in the country. I would have thought its management would be the most conservative entity you could conceive of. Why would it openly admit to be preparing to receive an alien visitor? That takes a while to absorb. That's not a rumor. It's been confirmed by a visit there. Tom and Chris went there and visited, and they're open about it. We have copies of documents that were distributed. They've since been pulled, but we have copies of them. And see, the UFO, they can be tangible. They can be monitored on multiple radars. They leave tangible evidence behind, burnt ground, radioactivity. They participate in formation flying, evidence knowledgeable pilot. There were 432 cases studied by the Air Force, highly classified, that demonstrated that they are piloted by knowledgeable pilots in formation. 432 examples. I happen to be involved in that. However, they violate physical laws. They go faster than sound without sonic booms. They make right-angle turns at extreme speeds. And they materialize and disappear suddenly without any trace at all. What on earth is going on? You experience one of these, you think you've had an hallucination. No, it's on the record. They show up on the radar. I can remember vividly when I was entering the Naval Academy, it was June of 1952. And there were UFOs that shut down Washington National Airport in those days, and also Andrews Air Force Base in Washington. They were shut down for the better part of a week. And I have copies. I meant to include the slides. I forgot to do where these UFOs, they would muster, the Air Force mustered interceptors. They chased them, couldn't catch them. They'd disappear. They'd land. They'd come back. They harassed those two major airports, the Washington National, that was the primary airport back in those days there, and Andrews Air Force Base. And that went on for the better part of a week. I remember the newspapers every day. The jets are and they'd muster the jets and chase them and not catch them, and they disappear. That wasn't somebody's report. That was happening over our nation's capital for the better part of a week. I happen to remember it because I happened to be there that month, because I happened to be the month that I was entering the Naval Academy as a plebe. So I was in the region for that reason. And of course, the overshadowing dilemma here is, why do they enjoy a higher military classification than our most sensitive warheads? And here's where I could probably spend a few moments explaining something about compartmentalization. If you have a contract that has content that you want to be sensitive, you can designate that content as some level top secret or whatever. But if you're really anxious to hide what you're doing, you can compartment it. What they mean by that is you can make the existence of the contract classified information. They call that a compartmented program. What it means is your competitors don't know they exist. They're wonderful. They're not very profitable because they're negotiated contracts, but they're wonderful pieces of work because your competitors don't know you've got the contract. That's very commonly done, typically in the intelligence community. But I discovered, after being in all that for 30 years, there is a third level. There's one where you contract the content, fine. There's where you have the existence of the contract classified, the second. There's a third level. That's where the existence of the customer is classified. And I ran into one of those, and boy, did we learn some interesting lessons. So the good news is the Department of Defense has learned to keep a secret when they want to. And they do. Why should the events at Roswell, New Mexico in 1947 still remain classified after 66 years? You can't find out the answer. And this whole issue of Majestic 12. Harry Truman sets up 12 people, 6 civilians, 6 military, to be a committee to figure out what to do about UFOs that year. The document that impaneled that committee, some documents that have to do with the disposition of alien bodies, surface. They're around for a few weeks when the community suddenly realizes those are hoaxes. The memo that authorized Magic 12 was a hoax. These manuals that were floating around, someone went to an elaborate nonsense to create a hoax. So there's two kinds of people around, those that never heard of it, Magic 12, and those that know it was a hoax back 20 years ago, whatever. They don't understand the use of disinformation. That's the clever way to hide something. Surface some information about it and let it get discredited. So it's a hoax, and everybody knows it's a hoax. And most people, well, Majestic 12, that was a hoax. No. A guy by the name of Stanton Freeman decided to make a career of tracking down the dossiers of those 12 Americans. And he spent 20 years going to private libraries and collecting desk art, whatever he could find out with those 12 people. And he published a book called Majestic 12 of what he discovered. And it's really astonishing to realize, no, they were impaneled in some very interesting ways. I won't spend the time on that here, other than to say that, to cut it through, it doesn't mean I'm right, but I believe Majestic 12 is real. It's obviously changed its name. Its composition has changed over the years, but I think there is a highly secret group where you call it the Collins elite, or maybe it's part of the Jasons, who knows. So the question is, these are astonishing things for us to try to absorb. Why is the Vatican anticipating an alien visitor? There are discussions within the Vatican as to whether or not he can be baptized. Is he sinful or sinless? There are issues, there are theological issues that they're wrestling with. And the question that this surfaces, how would an extraterrestrial confirmation impact the global perspectives theologically? What would happen on the planet Earth if a real alien of some kind shows up? What does that do to your conceptions about God, about Jesus, about the Bible? Would it shake those? Is that going to cause an awful lot of people to rethink things? Very, very strange. It may surprise you to know or realize that there have been some prominent Americans, namely Douglas MacArthur in one of his speeches, John F. Kennedy in another of his speeches, Ronald Reagan in one of his speeches, made public conjectures that what it will take to bring peace on the earth is a threat from outer space, so that we might forget our differences and rally around that kind of a threat. They use it rhetorically as an idiom, but it's amazing when you go through the records how frequently that has come up as a concept. How would an extraterrestrial confirmation impact the global perspective of people? Would a cosmic incident galvanize a global government? See, the one conclusion that you come out of by wading through some of these things that we've been talking about is that there is a delusion coming. And I think it's a waste of our time to try to second guess it, because it is a delusion. It's the most skillful, crafted delusion in the history of mankind. It is the seed of the serpent's grand opportunity. I personally have the suspicion that the reason the harpazo is not scheduled clearly is to catch Satan by surprise. Almost every other event, when you study the events of the end times, you can sort of lay out in relative to one another. It's amazing how much that can be pretty much, except there's one event that is clearly unscheduled. It could happen tonight. It could happen 20 years from now. We don't know. The harpazo. But we do know that when that harpazo hits, that's a starting gun, and Satan knows he's got a very limited window. He knows he has but a short time, the Scripture tells us. And Jesus warns us that there's going to be a delusion that if it were possible, it would deceive the very elect. This is not a trivial little doctrinal issue. Something very, very fundamental is going to hit the airwaves here. Paul talks about it also in another way in 2 Thessalonians 2. That it is not just a general deception. No, it's a specific lie that is going to descend upon those who failed to acknowledge the truth. Everybody thinks there's going to be some kind of big revival before the end. There may be. I tend to see the opposite. An attempt at a revival will fall flat. And because they did not have a love of the truth, it's God who's going to send or permit this delusion. It's a specific delusion. And it's going to be global. And since it's Satan's finest hour, it's going to be a doozer. That's what's coming. And I think it's silly for us to try to second guess it. There's no, clearly as you look at the possibilities, they go far beyond our imagination. I think the world, the day after the harpazo, the world is going to be so different, it's impossible to imagine it. The turmoil globally is going to be enormous. It's going to be Satan's finest hour. It is his grand opportunity. And he knows he's got a short window. Trying to second guess that is a silly waste of time. What is important is for us to prepare ourselves in our own spiritual hygiene, to do our homework, not to try to second guess these things, but simply gather what we can from the Word of God. Not Chuck Missler's conjectures, not fill in the blank. No. From the Word of God. To dig in deep and position ourselves on the sidelines, not trying to second guess it, but to prepare ourselves for what He is doing. Because He has a calling for every one of us in this room. And the challenge you've got is to discover what that is. And I don't have a magic formula for that. God will take care of that. But He has a calling for each of us. And so is the global deception being readied for the final climax? I believe so. I think we're on the threshold of it. Does that mean it's going to happen next week or next month or next year? I don't know. There are some things that have to happen that's going to take some substantial time. The city of Babylon's got to reemerge on the banks of the Euphrates. That won't happen in 30 days. But it has got to happen to receive its judgment. So there is some intervals yet to happen. That's the good news. That means we've got some time to catch our breath. We've got some time to do our homework. Now, I've left a lot of open issues here. Is he really the last pope? A lot of people who've studied this think he is. And certainly the Vatican has been badgered by scandals. The pedophile thing is just astonishingly pervasive in that world. And the accusations of Satan worship in the deepest bowels of the Vatican continue from people who busy themselves with those things. And the whole field of astrobiology commitments, that's so bizarre. That's a science with no evidence whatsoever. We can talk a little bit more about that tomorrow if you like. And the whole tradition of the Vatican where the Pope is supposed to be the vicar of Christ, the one standing in his place, bizarre stuff we're dealing with here. In your notes, you have a reading list. Obviously, Petrus Romanus is the book that Tom Horn and Chris Putnam published in 2012. And it'll tell you more about the prophecy of the papacy you probably really want to know. It's a very, very thorough study. But a book that you must have for your library, if you can get your hands on one, is a book that was written by Dave Hunt called The Woman Rides the Beast. And there is a classic book by Alexander Hislop called The Two Babylons. And it's a classic that is in most Christians, serious Christians' library. It's a bit argumentative. Clearly, Dave Hunt's book vastly eclipses it and does a better job. It really documents the background of what it's well documented all the way through. Dave, however, is so focused on the Vatican aspect, he is blind to the literal Babylon aspect. And he and I had a different point of view on that. I happen to believe, I think he's correct, but I think both views are correct, and I explained that through Zechariah 5, and you've heard me on that. But A Woman Rides the Beast, if you're a Catholic or have any interest in, you need to take a look at that. If you can get your hands on a Haley's Bible Handbook, preferably an edition prior to 1965, I would, if it's the Billy Graham edition, I'd pass it because it's been expurgated. But there's also a book that we're going to try to carry here called The Pilgrim Church by E.H. Broadbent. It was published originally in 1931, fell out of print, and it was Dave Hunt's energies that caused it to get back in print, interestingly enough. It's a book that I believe is an essential book in every serious Christian's library. And I'm sure you can get it through Amazon.com or whatever. And then there's a book that is one of the best, most thorough resources I can imagine. It's called Exo Vaticana, and I won't try to explain how Tom Horn gets these titles, but the point is that's the title of the book by Tom Horn and Chris Putnam, and it includes some of the most in-depth scholarship I've ever seen on several subjects. It does an incredible job at capturing and explaining the whole UFO area in ways that are very impressive, and I've read a lot in that area. He also deals with astrobiology in some very, very interesting ways. It's one of the most outstanding books on my library. You can't borrow my copy, sorry. We'll try to get some here. Exo Vaticana by Tom Horn. So with that, let's have a closing word of prayer.